Okay, so that's what I wanted to show you with visualization. Again, it's a very deep topic, but we just really only had the time just to introduce it. The assignment that you're doing for it is fairly simple. You'll just follow a very similar structure to what I've shared here. The second topic, and I guess the last topic before final project, is database integration. So obviously, there are times when you want to store your data that you are utilizing in your program, or you need to access an existing database where data is being stored to utilize in your program. Another thing that there's a lot of depth here, but we don't really get into too much, but you can at least see how to connect to a database, how to access a database, and how to edit a database. But integrating with databases allows for extensive new abilities in your program development. For instance, if you're only interested in a subset of the data available, keeping it all in a database would make sense. The nice thing about databases is they are often a shared format, so multiple other applications can access this data as necessary. As long as you store it in the database in a known format, they can access it from the database in a known format. And if you've got a really large data set, trying to hold it all within your program is inefficient and unwieldy. So keeping that data stored off in a database makes a lot of sense. So let's create a simple database, and then let's load some data into it. And actually, I think I need to very quickly delete my existing one because I already have one. Is it here? Is it here? I don't see it. Okay, I must have already deleted it. Okay, so I'm going to create an empty database, connect to it, and then drop the connection. Very simple. First of all, I have to import SQLite 3. SQLite 3 is a database type. It is a relational database type that comes built in with Python. So you don't have to install like MySQL or full-blown SQL or NoSQL or whatever. It is already built in. It's a great way to get comfortable with databases, and before you have to connect to a real corporate level type database environment. So I'm going to import SQLite 3, and then I'm going to import error, which just allows me to get better error messages when I run across them if I have issues. And this function here is create connection. I'm going to do a try except and a finally. So first I'm going to try to connect to my database, which will be sent in to the function. So I will give the database a name. It will try to connect to it. If it doesn't find it, it will create it. And then it's going to print the version just because. But if there's an error, it's going to print the error, and then it's going to close that connection. So we got to make sure that those connections to the databases get closed when we're done with them. And then I'm going to call my function and send it a database name of weatherdata.db. So when I run this, you're going to see if I go over here, refresh this, I now have a new database at the very end of my list called weatherdata.db. It's an empty database, there's nothing in it, but it exists. So that's all I've done. I tried to connect to the database, didn't find it, created a database, and then I disconnected from it. Now let's do something a little bit more useful than that, because that's not super useful. I'm going to mess with that weather data that we looked at last week. If you remember, I had like a year's worth of weather data with some different attributes on a daily basis for Des Moines. So this should look very familiar. I'm going to import that data again. I'm utilizing that file as CSV file, same stuff I've done before. First, I'm going to skip, I guess I don't skip the first line in this case, but for each item in the row in that file, I'm going to assign it, oh yeah, I do skip the first line, there it is right there. For each line in that file after the first line, I'm going to import or put an item into each one of these lists. So date gets an item, max temp gets an item, min temp, av temp, precip, and new snow. So essentially I'm loading up 6 different lists with all the data from that file. Now I've run that, so I've got my lists. I'm going to show you this quick. This is kind of an aside, but you will probably want to utilize this. There is a program called DB Browser that is a free program. Somebody just created a labor of love to allow a nice view of, I use it for SQLite, but it's used for other things as well. So I can see my database. So if I go to DB Browser, you'll have to install it. That link there will get you there. This is what the GUI looks like for this. If I want to access a database, I just need to click on Open Database. And then I need to browse out to where that database is, which you'll get to see my computer file structure as I do that. And there's my database that I just created. If I open that up, now I can see my database. So there are no tables yet. There's really nothing. It's just an empty database called weatherdata.db. This is a great way to see, as you step through your program, that the things that you're doing are actually happening in your database. So that's that. And now I'm going to do something. So you can see again from earlier, I'm creating my connection, my function to create my connection, same as before. And then I've got a function called create table. And unfortunately, I've got too much in this cell, so I'm going to have to exit out. I've got a function here called create table. And this allows me to create a table. First, it accesses the connection, which is my SQLite 3. And then it says what the name of the table is that I want to create. So it's going to try to first connect to the database, and then it's going to execute the SQL create table code. And that's going to be create the table. The method is called execute, and it's going to execute the table creation of this table that you're sending to the function. And then I've got another function that actually does the creation of the tables. This is the one that calls the other one. So if you follow this through, here's the SQL code that's utilized. So it's create table if not exists, and then it's going to call it weather, and date, county, max temp, min temp, ab temp, precip, and new snow. So it's creating all of those columns in that new table. And then it's going to, first I create a variable called create connection database, and then if it's not none, create the table. Otherwise, say it's unable to connect to the database. So that's just a catch in case it doesn't connect properly. And then at the very end, I'm running the code, and you can see it calls create tables weatherdata.db. So it comes into this one, and it goes through this, and it runs the SQL to create the table on the correct database. And then at the very end, it does the create table, and it runs this up here. So if I run this, you're going to see now I have created a new table in my database. If I come over here, refresh, now you can see I've got a weather table. And now that I have a table, I can view it. So if I double click on this, you can see all the columns are there now. And I can actually browse the data on that table. There's nothing in that table yet other than the columns. So I need to actually load some data into this table now, which I'm going to do now. So now I've got my empty table with columns for each item of my data. And now I'm ready to load that data into my new table. So for this one, I've got a function add record, and it's just going to run this SQL code, insert or ignore into table weather, and then date, county, max temp, min temp, ab temp, precip, and new snow. And this is the structure you use because you pass those values in to it. This is SQL code. Unfortunately, this is outside of Python, so it's kind of a separate thing that you have to learn if you're going to be working extensively with databases. SQL code is pretty ubiquitous if you're going to be interacting with databases. But this is what you would utilize to do an insert or ignore. And what the or ignore does is it just stops you from creating repeated records if they already exist. And then grab the cursor object here and then execute the SQL for the record. And then it returns the row ID so you can see the record's primary key. And now I'm going to utilize that function. First, I'm going to create that connection. And then with that connection, I'm going to do a for loop and keep repeatedly calling that function for every line in my lists. So it takes what's the record called, it gives you the date, they're all Des Moines, and then the data for the N is, so it starts at 0. So for row, or for item 1 in each one of the lists, it grabs it and creates a record. And then item 2 in each one of the lists, it grabs it and creates a record. And then it utilizes add record. So if I run this now, if I go back over to DB browser, you can see now it refreshed on its own. I now have a table loaded up with all of my year's worth of data. So I was able to gather the data from the CSV file, format it in the way I want, and then output it to my database. Now that I have my database the way I want it, I can query that database for information that I need. So in this cell, I'm going to create a function called select all weather. And when you do select all, it's just essentially a select star from table. So select star from weather. And then I do cur.fetch all. So basically connect to the database and fetch all of the data. And then it returns the rows to main. So I run it, I say with connection, give me all of the weather, and then print the rows. So if I run this now, you're going to see it prints out all of that data in tuples that I pulled from my database. So I was able to gather data from a CSV, write it to a database, access that database to bring back into my program. I can also update existing data in my database if I want to. There you see, if you look up here, there's this precipitation column has T for trace. That's not super useful if you're trying to do like a mathematical thing on it. So I would like to just like to change trace to just 0 because it's essentially 0. And I can do that here. You can see I've created a function called update precip. And what it does is it runs this SQL update weather table set precip to 0 wherever it finds that precip is T. Make sure if you're doing something like this that you have your where clause set up correctly, because if you don't do your where clause, it's just going to update that entire column to 0. And that would probably overwrite something that you don't want to overwrite, and could also be unfixable, because once you write it to the database, you can't necessarily undo it. This would also be a good point to point out that you might want to do database backups before you make any kind of edit manipulation on your existing database, just in case you break something. So that's the function, and then I just say create the connection, and then with the connection, do update precip, so it's calling my function, and then it's going to do select all weather and print the rows. So essentially I'm updating it, and then I'm going to print it again so you can see it. And now you can see that the precip column is now 0, where it used to be trace. The other column is still trace because I didn't bother with that, but you can see the precip column no longer says trace. So those are things you can do with a database. Again, this is just a very simple intro. The assignment for the database stuff is not very complex, so you should be able to make quick headway of that and get it completed and submitted. That's all I have to show for new stuff for essentially the entire semester. The